good afternoon, and most welcome to 1011. And I will continue a little bit and try to sort of cross-link the two latest lectures, 1010 and 1009. In 1009 we were talking about the separation of the senses, and that is idiosyncratic to Western languages, and it's always done after the fact, after it's happened, so to speak. Oddly enough, this has connections to quantum mechanics. Do remember Sir Roger Penrose and the example of the tennis game. It is Federer who plays somebody, he makes the quantum wave collapse, and we are sitting as the audience, and we see existences do things to each other, and we create cause and effect. This is after things has happened, and two good pointers to that is of course Benjamin Libet, that shows that our evaluation, our cause and effect, our connectedness, the linear connectedness, is always after the fact. It doesn't come simultaneous with the fact, so it could be taken from reality, but it's what he calls a described quality. And for some reason, and I think that is historically founded in the Western tradition, we call this consciousness. But some people have sort of widen and deepen this understanding. One of those people is of course Richard E. Lind, and he shows that reflective consciousness, or S as he calls it, or RC, is a specific Western development. It does not exist in Eastern culture, and it has very little to do with the consciousness that direct action. This reflective consciousness is not connected at all to action, and therefore it doesn't have a sort of ontological role to play in the universe. It is of ontic character. It is after the why question, and it's constructed after the fact. It is constantly like having something hanging from your back and you dragging it along with you when you walk your life path. It is not something that is actually part of reality. It drags you, it slows the processes down. As Libet showed, decision making is actually slowed down by the reflective consciousness. And that problem doesn't evolve with people who has more normal consciousness or action consciousness. Reflective consciousness is, if you read Richard E. Lind carefully, not a consciousness at all. It is just a repetitive thought process, and it can actually be seen from the perspective of the cerebellum. When the cerebellum is not working properly, you have this hang glider after yourself, or I like to think about it as a parachute. If you throw yourself out of an airplane and then you land, it can sometimes be very hard to get rid of the parachute because it's a complex web of things. You can be hanging in a tree, and there you are hanging. And this is a very good description what is happening when the cerebellum is not in good working order, when it's lowered on the scale for action. It doesn't send the signals to the brain in sync, and therefore an after image is made instead of the proper image, and it's a sort of a shaded copy that we have to do with. And that goes actually quite nicely hand in hand with the metaphors that Richard E. Lind gives us. He says that because of this raisal of the consciousness to the head, it says goodbye to the body. And by saying goodbye to the body, we say goodbye to the world, because the body is our connection to the world. This is how we know the world, real properties. What we also say goodbye to, and this is how I draw in the 1009 lecture, and that is the senses. Since we don't have access to the senses, the reflective consciousness automatically designate different parts of the sensory awareness to what the reflective consciousness sees as different senses. And by doing so, it takes away a lot of knowledge and sort of blocks the sensory experience, because that is situated in the body. We also discussed 4 or 5 lectures ago, when we were in the gallery, that this stiffening of the neck, which can also be read in the Bible, I don't know if it's in the Genesis or where it is.
Exodus.
Exodus.
Chapter 32.
In chapter 32, you can read about a stiff-necked people who were not perceptible to the voice of God or the commandments or the message. And this is quite literally true. When we tense our necks and we get into this fright and flight state, we don't have access to the body anymore, or to a very small degree. We quite literally block off the signals coming through the atlanto-occipital joint. This is the very, very thin line, the very sensitive, and where the cervical is very small as well. It's scary little. It's this size. And the whole head, the whole 9 pounds or 10 pounds rests on this incredibly thin and sensitive balance. So any thought that is disruptive and not sure and not having the safety enough will actually disrupt the balance. And we used to call this, remember when we were thinking about the butterfly effect from a thought. Here clearly we don't need the butterfly effect even, because it's so obvious. A singular thought that is unbalanced, what we usually call negative thoughts, that have nothing to do with the positive thoughts. I think that whole invention is problematic in itself. Negative thinking is just lack of complexity. Lack of complexity is something we can see from the cerebellum. Very clearly, if you make a magnetic radiation inference, an MRI, or can also be visible in an electroencephalogram, shows that the waves are too repetitive, too predicative, so they won't give a good result. The thinking that comes out is weak. That weak thinking will in itself cause a lack of balance, that minute butterfly effect. A singular thought that is negative, disruptive, sharp, hasty. We're talking neurons too, those fast fetch neurons that react instantaneously. They react instantaneously, but still before the fact, by giving a certain picture of reality that is black and white, good and bad, too simplified to actually go into reality. And you can see how this sort of spirals down. For every time you get a negative impulse, you stiffen your neck, and the result is your predicting power of your own reality diminishes, and your thinking capacity to do projections, to plan and have good results will go down. As Shamiri pointed out, you can go down to a state that only maybe a fifth of your decisions will be accurate and have a positive result. And thereby, in the end, you give up. And as I discussed with Henry, and this is very good, this is the reason that most Westerners, when it comes to really hard decisions, like what car should I buy, where should I live, we use instinct, because we know we can't trust our left hemisphere thinking or this disruptive thinking, and we shouldn't. It's really bad idea to trust it. So what is instinct or intuition? Well, it's nothing but sheer randomness. When you stop thinking, you let randomness come into the picture, and you will receive this 50%. Otherwise, you will not have the 50%. You'll have something much lower, because the thinking leads you quite predictably astray. It is always wrong, and nothing could be more wrong than being out of sync, being after the fact. This is the killing thing in sports, and sports is, interestingly enough, one of those few areas even Westerners have an exception. They use the right hemisphere. They don't have this hang glider after themselves. They don't have reflective consciousness. They have a true consciousness, the one that can actually reflect and sort of supervise thinking. And you see here, when you don't have a supervisor, if you're just into this reflective consciousness, you cannot sort of steer your own thinking. You can't steer your organism. I mentioned earlier, the world is in itself fractal, and the space that we put in our body map, if that space is of the Cartesian character, we will not be localized. Our bodies, our proprioception, our kinesthesia, this very, very sensitive balancing system that you find underneath and inside of the cochlea, the free balancing organ, one organ that shows acceleration, one that shows situation in three perpendicular directions, and a third one that is speed. When these ones cannot be in harmony and are not balanced up, you don't know where you're going, in which speed you're going, you don't even know your direction. And this is the point when we start to use our eyes to direct ourselves. Eyskens pointed this out. One of his great revelations was that the blind people were almost lacking misuse, or at least to a great extent. And he wondered why, because a blind person should actually suffer more, because he should be afraid of what's around him. Thanks to his blindness, he cannot guide himself with eyes. How do we guide ourselves with our eyes? Well, we look for the horizon in a very, very complicated way, and then we try to arrange our body after the horizon. It's very sensitive. If the horizon is off, our body is going to be off, and our direction is going to be off. And how often do we have a clear horizon? Often we use buildings that are around us, sharp buildings with building blocks and such things, but they won't lead us correctly because our inherent balance is not taken into consequence. How do I stimulate my inherent balance? Well, it's not that complicated. I get a little bit in that way by using sunglasses, but I need to take away more. We need to take away so much as we can't see shapes anymore. We can't see horizon, and we can't see objects. And thereby we force the system to go over to a more natural way of conducting movement. And that's the three-part balancing organ in our ears. We can do that by shutting our eyes or squinting very hard, which I don't recommend. Well, I'm not very good at squinting anymore. I used to be, but I notice when I squint now, I give myself a headache. But I would recommend, as I do every morning, at least the first half hour, I do everything by not looking. Sometimes I manage to do 1 hour, and afterwards you don't feel anything special. Maybe sometimes I felt a certain calmness, but not usually nothing. But what will happen in the end? There is a restructuring going on, and once you practice this Aiskin said somewhere between 13 and 14 months. If you do it on a daily basis, half an hour, you will once more have access to the balancing organs, even if you just put on very, very dark sunglasses, because this takes away a little bit of that sharpness that is associated with the object world, that the vision world, where we divide the senses and where we have objects, and that when we are like the audience in Wimbledon looking at the game that Federer plays, not being actively engaged in the game, we make up a history of cause and effect, and we see him almost like it was always already decided that he was to hit the ball. But only Federer and maybe his competitor will know it was actually decided in that very moment when the superposition was, so to speak, collapsed. And the instrument of the collapse is, of course, the tennis racket. But it could be a good thing to think that tennis racket is important in this sequence. It's not without a casting rope. Now I want to add a little bit about fractality as well. I've gone in more to people who try to see perception as one whole and not dividing perception in different sense organs. And the more I read about it, the more sense it makes. It doesn't make any sense anymore to divide sensory input, because it's always after the fact, and why on earth should we have 5 different senses? And then we have to see which is the strongest one and compare them. It doesn't make sense. This is obviously one of those desk solution, skrivbordslösning. Some laboratory assistant or doctor have been sitting at his table and see could be good sense to divide these different things into 5 different poles, so to speak, so I can analyze them one by one. But in real life it doesn't make any sense, and they are actually possible to put into one modular thing. And these looks like this. This is pictures that shows what I think it's
No,
called.
I think I don't.
Yeah, maybe.
Thank you.
Does it work?
Not really.
Any better?
No, there's too much reflection pop up.
Oh. These are the modular curves, and they show what happens in a situation. It is a great complexity, and this complexity is what informs the situation, the happening, or as Heidegger would call it, the presencing, the actual happening. And this is, of course, his telos of his neologism, to show us the way to presencing. And he usually describes that as thea and aletheia, and that is to get away from the idea of sameness, representation, things being out there and we being here. And I can now, after the very nice book that we checked before in 2 lectures ago, we could actually
Synesthesia?
yes, synesthesia. It's very nice. I do recommend it, because this is not a complicated book. This could make a very nice read some afternoon if you have vacation or something like that. Do even buy it, because it also makes a good reference book, and it's massive. The references at the end is substantial. She also did her work, or they are 2 authors. No, it doesn't make any sense, and this, I hope this is visible. Or maybe it's not.
No, no, it's not visible.
It's a shame.
Go to the shadow.
Where do we have shadow? Shadow, shadow, walk by me. Well, I have to just link this paper. Too bad. This is the same thing as I showed before, a modular circle, but here is with color addition. So our proper memory, so to speak, is a multicolored, multi-audible, multi-tactile, multi-proprioceptive, multi-kinesthesia, multi-olfactory. Everything should be there, because this is how our real presencing is. And one of the reasons we don't reach memory things is because we preemptively, before we look into the memory, before we do the retention, we have this really odd thing, as Libet called the mask, or the shield. And the shield blocks access to memories, because memories are always holograms, and that means they contain everything: taste, olfactory. And if you say, that memory is purely visionary, as I usually do, it's very hard to reach that memory. And I have a sort of an ersatz, or ersatz mean something they use instead of the real thing. It's actually an English word, and that is that the memories are visual, for my sake, just visual, doesn't contain anything. They're not very personal, but instead I give them meaning. And I think this meaning with citation mark or quotation marks is a little bit like cause and effect, something that we self-create and subjectively put to the fact. There is an ocean of complexity in cause and effect, but the normal take is just too blunt. It doesn't serve the purpose. It's too crude, and it's a little bit like juxtaposing things next to each other, and there is no real connection to them. And this is one of the things that really made quantum mechanics turn over classical physics, because there is a problem in classical physics, and that is with cause and effect. It is lacking depth and width. It doesn't go into the moment. It's a generalized cause and effect. And as every quantum mechanical experiment is not repeatable, when I first heard that, I thought that is a bad thing. But I realized later on, it's very far from a bad thing. It's a fantastic thing. All of a sudden, quantum mechanics looks more like reality. And now I want to bring the other lecture we made. Modern day reading is this biased way that a cause and effect is already in place when we start the book. And if we access 5% of Shakespeare, I think I'm exaggerating. My former teacher, Stratton Taborn, he said nobody can read Shakespeare anymore. And I think he was right, because we are just too crude. We don't get into the text. The subject is the most important. We realize that in neurology. Academia is still waiting, but as long as the subject is gone and the subject doesn't get more refined, we cannot access that literature. It doesn't matter what Bloom said. He blames postmodernism, the factors of modern day and all that, technology for instance. He's gone now, I'm afraid, but he wouldn't have likened the internet neither. But I don't think that those are the true causes of the problems we are facing today. The problems were already present long time ago, millennia ago, and it has to do with how we raised our consciousness away from perception, away from thinking, and we made it into a simplified automatic process that lacks the possibility of actually having awareness. And there starts the problem, and dividing the senses is one aspect of those problems. Well, you can imagine if reality has this at least 6 sides to it, and we block out 2 of them, or 4 of them, or 3 of them. Of course, that would make both protension and retention become very much simplified and inaccessible. And no wonder we are having great problems these days with memory and all those things. It's just amazing. Sorry for my lack of focus. I just saw something I didn't like to see. But things you've seen can't be made unseen. And so is this lecture. I say thank you very much here from the central garden of Gothenburg. If you have your ways around here, do pay to visit, because it's absolutely stunning now in late May, early June. I would say it's coming to this most beautiful state now.
Thank
Have
you.
a nice afternoon,
Thank you.
and bye bye for now.